I gotta say, the experience of watching this felt like one giant punch to the gut. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another installment of my Zack Snyder review series, where I'm going through all of Zack Snyder's films that I have yet to review. And today we're talking about his fifth film, Sucker Punch. Let me know in the comments before we begin what your thoughts on Sucker Punch were, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my channel out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it, and let's talk about Sucker Punch. This stars Emily Browning as Babydoll, a young girl institutionalized by her abusive stepfather who retreats to an alternative reality as a coping strategy and envisions a plan to help her escape. Just so you know, as I've done with most of my reviews in this series, this will contain spoilers. So, if you haven't seen Sucker Punch and wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie and then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. Of all the films in Snyder's filmography, this was his passion project. There were talks of this as far back as 2007 when Snyder mentioned he put working on this aside to do Watchmen. And because of the success of Watchmen, as well as 300 for that matter, Snyder was given pretty much free rein to do whatever he wanted here. Now, not only did Snyder direct and produce this, but this is one of the very few films where he had a hand in the screenplay, as the story was his idea, and he co-wrote it with Steve Shibuya. Despite that, the film received a ton of negative reviews, and it was considered a box office failure, barely making up for its budget. So, what happened? Well, Snyder himself has described this film as Alice in Wonderland with machine guns, which kind of was the vibe I remember getting from seeing the trailer. The film heavily marketed the visuals and this fantasy world that Babydoll escaped to, in addition to the music, where we got a number of slower covers of songs like Sweet Dreams and Where Is My Mind. And I'd say, yeah, the areas where I'd praise this film are the visuals, as well as his music choices. Each scene is bursting with color as we get transported to these different worlds, ranging from a steampunk World War I to feudal Japan. And the fight scenes within each of these fantasy worlds were entertaining, and they'd be a lot of fun. But when it comes to the story, though, that's where this movie falls apart. Big time. If you've been following me for a bit, you'll remember one thing I said regarding the Snyder cut of the Justice League is that while I'm all for artists being able to tell their complete visions for a movie, I am weary when it's Snyder telling his vision. Now, while I thought that movie was good, what made me especially nervous leading up to it was this movie, as the story was all him. While being his fifth feature film, this was the first time we saw Snyder showing off his vision and his vision alone for a film. He directed it, he wrote it, and he produced it. Now, one thing that stuck with me was that Snyder stated this film can be interpreted as a critique of quote-unquote geek culture's sexism and objectification of women. Now, that's a good thing to explore, and I'm on board there. The problem is, he winds up having nothing to say on the subject. While the film focuses on female protagonists who do get to tear down most of the people in their way, I still hesitate to call them strong characters, and the reason being that we learn literally nothing about them. This suffers from a similar problem that Snyder's previous film, Legend of the Guardians, also had, and it's the fact that you could have switched the majority of these characters around in terms of their respective roles, and it would have had the same effect on you emotionally. All of their dialogue, all of their actions, could have been done by any of them, outside of a select handful of moments. Most of the dialogue isn't memorable, outside of a number of lines that I'll get to in a moment. They don't perform any specific actions that only they could have done, and they don't have distinct personalities. Their character traits start and end at the conflict at hand, similar to Legend of the Guardians. So for a film that's supposed to critique objectifying women, it kind of feels like this objectifies women. A lot of the story involves things like women using their bodies to provide a distraction for the other characters, and they're only interesting when they do things like stylish poses and cool stunts, and there's nothing to them, personality-wise. On top of that, there seems to be something of an obsession with showing sexual assault, as there are a number of sequences where we see one of these women either being assaulted or come close to it, and it gets pretty uncomfortable to say the least. So this almost becomes what it set out to critique. Now, as far as the story structure goes, I will say that when it all comes together, I kind of get what Snyder was going for, but it still doesn't work. Because the way it's structured doesn't really allow room for emotional investment when you think about it. The film goes down the Inception route, where you'll get fantasy sequences within fantasy sequences, but the point where one of these sequences in particular kicks in winds up ruining the entire movie as far as I'm concerned. So the bookending sequences take place within this asylum where Babydoll is being held. Her stepfather bribes an orderly, played by Oscar Isaac, to forge the signature of the asylum's doctor, played by Carla Gugino, so that Babydoll is lobotomized. The reason being, the stepfather murdered Babydoll's sister, framed her, and this way she can't tell anyone. And we see early on that Babydoll is about to be lobotomized, with the doctor performing the procedure being played by John Hamm. And this takes up the first 15 minutes or so of the movie, give or take. And up until this point, it's relatively easy to follow. However, the fantasy sequences kick in at the exact moment Babydoll's about to be lobotomized. We're now transported to a brothel, where the Oscar Isaac and Carla Gugino characters are reinterpreted as a mobster and dance instructor respectively. And Babydoll is now a dancer at this brothel, and she meets 4 other women played by Abby Cornish, Jenna Malone, Jamie Chung, and Vanessa Hudgens. And now, the majority of the action takes place within this brothel setting, and you're led to assume that the brothel symbolizes the asylum, and the escape plan by the 5 women in the brothel is really them all trying to escape the asylum. And the fantasy sequences of feudal Japan and World War I all correspond to something going on within the brothel, not the asylum, if that'll make sense.
A donut hole in a donut's hole. But we must look a little closer. And when we do, we see the donut hole has a hole in its center.
And that's all fine, but here's the thing. While all of the sequences are themselves entertaining, it's hard to have any sort of emotional investment in them, and that's because we're led to believe, for the majority of this movie, Babydoll is supposedly imagining all of this at the exact moment she's about to be lobotomized. Not flashing back, imagining it. We're led to believe the majority of this movie is in her head, and keep in mind, up until this point, we barely learned a thing about her character to begin with. We know about the conflict she's in, but nothing about her personality. So why should we care? If we know, or at least if we're told, this is all supposed to be in her head, why should we care about anything in this brothel sequence, as well as the fantasy sequences within the brothel sequences? The only real emotional weight was within the asylum where Babydoll's about to be lobotomized, but the way we transition from one setting to the other makes little to no sense. Snyder calls the movie Alice in Wonderland with machine guns. Okay. But in Alice in Wonderland, we actually see Alice find a door that transports her into Wonderland, and we're led to believe that this fantastical world is all real, so there's emotional stakes there. And if you want another example, look at The Wizard of Oz. We see Dorothy supposedly be physically transported from Kansas to the land of Oz. So even though it's now a more fantastical world, in contrast to the very real Kansas, we're being asked to believe it's all real. And we can because we actually see Dorothy's house land in Oz. But the way this transitions is Babydoll's about to be lobotomized, and she starts thinking of this brothel settings moments before the procedure happens. And to make matters even more confusing, when we cut to the brothel, we cut from Babydoll sitting in a chair to Sweet Pea, Abby Cornish's character, now sitting in a chair as part of rehearsals for a show, and Babydoll is seen as just entering the brothel for the first time. Not only does this transition not make sense, again I gotta repeat, we're meant to believe this is simply all in her head right from the start, and that none of this is real. So why are we being asked to invest the next hour and a half of our time to watch all this when we're led to believe it's supposedly not real? Even if the sequences themselves are entertaining, which they actually are, it doesn't matter because it doesn't feel like there are any true stakes. And yeah, I know how this all comes together, and bear with me, I will address that. But I do want to briefly talk about the fantasy sequences within the fantasy sequences. Again, they're entertaining. We get some pretty fun fight scenes, but even they don't totally make sense either. Mainly in the way that they don't 100% correspond to what's going on in the brothel. Like, all of the characters in the brothel are supposed to be reinterpretations of those in the asylum, and you'll see the same actors like Oscar Isaac and Carla Gugino reappear, just in new roles. But whoever it is that Babydoll and the other women are squaring off against in the brothel aren't explicitly reinterpreted in the other fantasy sequences. At least nothing that I caught. Like, for example, there's a scene where a fight against the brothel's cook is reimagined in the World War I sequence, but it's not like we explicitly see the same actor playing a new role. it's now a CGI robotic guard. And other than our 5 main characters, everyone in all of these sequences are reinterpreted in more abstract terms for these scenes, so the same rules don't really apply here, if you're following me. I know there are moments in the action scenes that wind up being consequential to what goes on in the brothel, but there's no consistency in terms of what mirrors what. The asylum to brothel mirrors are more concrete, while the brothel to action scene mirrors are more abstract, if you get what I'm saying.
It is not a donut hole, but a smaller donut with its own hole. And our donut is not whole at all.
Now, who we do see in the action scenes is a character known as the Wise Man, played by Scott Glenn, who we haven't seen anywhere but these action fantasy sequences. But he's supposed to act as this guide for our protagonists to help them get through these fight sequences, which is really an interpretation of them getting out of the brothel. And I remember how he was advertised quite a lot in the trailers, and he said all these very dramatic lines that made it sound like this movie was going to be so deep. And that was part of what intrigued me when initially seeing this. The thing is, though, 95% of what this character says is nothing but platitudes and word salad. Very little of it is anything of actual substance, and some of it's nonsensical, including the film's most bizarre line,
"Remember, don't ever write a check with your mouth you can't cash with your ass."
Okay. I don't know what that means, but okay. It winds up being a waste of Scott Glenn, and it comes off as very pretentious. Now, as I briefly mentioned earlier, this all comes back together in the end, as we eventually cut back to the asylum. And it gets revealed that everything we saw actually did happen. There's a passing line where it said that prior to the lobotomy, Babydoll did all of the things that we just saw, like help someone escape and kill an orderly. And you think you have some sort of emotional satisfaction hearing all this, but you don't. Or at least I didn't. Because as I've been saying, for the entire movie, you're led to believe this is just a fantasy world all in our head. Even if characters from the asylum are being reinterpreted for the brothel, the moment we cut from the asylum to the brothel is at the moment of the procedure happening. We didn't know that that much time passed in between all of this and that this was technically all flashback. It never once established that. So when we get this reveal, it's less of a shocking plot twist and more like, oh, okay, cool. I said earlier on that I got what this movie was going for, but the structure of leading us to believe that this was all just a fantasy and therefore had no emotional stakes, only to pull the rug from under us at the last second, is so disjointed and can almost come off as confusing. And on top of that, it's revealed that this isn't really Babydoll's story, but really Sweet Pea's story, which I guess kind of explains why the cut from the lobotomy to the brothel shows Sweet Pea instead of Babydoll. But it still doesn't totally make a ton of sense. Like, was Sweet Pea imagining that Babydoll was imagining these elaborate fight scenes? I wish I knew. I mean, if that's what they were going for, fine. But as the filmmaker, you need to be a little more explicit than that. On top of that, we now see the Wise Man, who at this point we only saw in those action scenes, now in the real world as a bus driver helping Sweet Pea escape. And it seems like he's aware of who she is, even though we never once saw him in the real world the entire time. And again, it doesn't make a ton of sense. Though, to be fair, that kind of fits in line with this character in general. But I've said this before hundreds of times. If you want to have this sort of mystery so that you allow the audience to put some pieces of the puzzle together for themselves, fine. But you still need to give them enough to work with. You can't be that abstract and then leave them clueless. There's a balance, and I didn't find that balance here. And because of that, it leads to a very frustrating experience. I got what it was going for, but the fact it was being intentionally cryptic and confusing without feeling totally justified left me kind of annoyed, to say the least. Sucker Punch is a hot mess. It's a film that's supposedly the critique about the objectification of women, yet it kind of does what it was critiquing, and as a result, offers nothing to say. On top of that, while you can put its somewhat confusing narrative together when you think about it, the way it's structured leaves things extremely disjointed and underwhelming, especially because we learned nothing about any of these characters along the way, nor were we ever given a reason to care about them. It's great from a visual standpoint, and while film's a very visual medium, there needs to be some sense of coherency to the visuals, and what we got was mostly abstract and inconsistent. While there are some cool ideas here, and it looks nice, it totally misses its mark as far as the storytelling goes. Sucker Punch gets a 4 out of 10. I found myself lowering my score for this as I was putting this review together. I remember not totally hating the movie when I first saw it, and even when I was watching it again, in the moment I was like, it's not bad, it's just the structure is off. But as I started thinking about it, it just left a really bad taste in my mouth. And as I was writing what I wanted to say, I felt the score go down and down and down. And I know it's one movie, but this was Snyder's passion project. So, as I said, this has always left me weary whenever I hear we're getting Snyder's complete vision for something. Visually, he's top notch, and with the right screenplay, he can give us a great movie. But when I hear something's mostly his brainchild, after this, I do get a bit nervous. But this covers everything I have yet to review by Snyder. I'll have a link to the playlist with all of these reviews, including his DCEU films, which I covered a few months ago, in the description below. And then up next will be my review of Army of the Dead, which hopefully should be a lot better than this, followed by my ranking of all of Snyder's movies. But in the meantime, let me know, did you see Sucker Punch, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did this make a whole lot of sense to you at all? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.